Hello everyone, Dr. Hanley-Tejeda here, and in this little video I'm just going to go over the cultural identity essay prompt. Cultural identity essay is the big paper of the semester, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page with what I'm looking for. You can think of this as an autoethnography, personal narrative, or family history paper. Autoethnography is an interesting term. Auto, of course, means self, and then ethnography is kind of like anthropology, but it's more like if an anthropologist went and lived with the culture for a while, you might think of them as an ethnographer, like Anthony Bourdain, right? When Anthony Bourdain goes and goes to a culture and actually tries the food and actually participates in the cultural rituals, right? That is more ethnographic. Whereas anthropology, in the traditional sense, people would go and I am studying the culture, and they would be very far and distant from that culture. Ethnography is more like you're an insider within the group. And so this is like self-writing about the group, right? So how can we study the group, but also in relationship to the self and who you are, right? It's also personal narrative, which is personal storytelling, right? The stories that we tell. And you can also think of it as kind of like a digging up of your family history. So just to kind of read through this context here, in meeting the demand to have self-awareness, so the fact that we should be aware when we engage in intercultural communication of ourself, especially, I want you to delve into your own cultural identity by understanding your familial histories. Studying intercultural communication allows us to reflect on ourselves as cultural beings. I want you to examine who you are by looking closely at your familial and cultural histories by writing a 6-page, at the minimum, 12-point font, double-spaced research paper. Some broad questions to consider throughout this process are: who are you? What is your history? Who are your people? What are your cultures? And that's really big. So who are you? At the most basic level, we'll learn in chapter 3, right, is what are your identity markers, right? How do you identify in terms of your social categories, in terms of race, class, gender? But even at another level, what is your history and who are your people? So how is your group historically identified, right? And how do you identify, right? And what are your various cultures? And this can be very difficult, oftentimes for North American students who have grown up in a context where they haven't really seen that they have culture, right? So that can be kind of a difficult thing to dig up, but try to become aware of how you are a cultural being, right? And I think the way to do that is to start to think about your history too, right? What has been your family's history in terms of immigration story, right? When did your great-grandfather arrive in the U.S., or have you guys always lived here? And start to dig that up, right? And so that's another way to think about it, is this family history, right? What is my history? What are my cultures, right? This kind of writing that you're about to engage in may be considered autoethnography, which is again that term, which is an autobiographical form of writing and research that seeks to connect the personal to the cultural. Ellis and Bachner quoted in YEP 70. The term can refer either to the ethnography of one's own group or to the autobiographical writing that has ethnographic interests, so called cultural interests, right? So writing about the self is autobiographical, but then at the same time it's element what about the group, right? Or the cultures that we belong to. Reading some examples of intercultural autoethnography by Gus Yep and Faye Kindes will also help you. So I'll post those on Canvas, some examples of autoethnography, this actual form of writing. One thing really cool about Faye Kindes is she uses photos throughout her little autoethnography, sample autoethnography. And she talks about fashion and how her Japanese American sisters and brothers used fashion to kind of assimilate they actually lived in Hawaii, I think during the 50s. So that's a really cool example of autoethnography, and I'll post those onto Canvas. So that's a little bit about the background of this paper. So who are you? What is your history? Who are your people, and what are your cultures? So another way to kind of think about this is like, how do you identify, right, in terms of the demographic markers, social categories, but then also, what is kind of been your context, right? So for me, for example, I might talk about how, although my mother was a first generation Mexican immigrant, I was raised by my white father and white mother and in a predominantly white area in Northern California, in the Bay Area. So I'd kind of like maybe interrogate that context about myself, right? And so although I'm sort of biologically of in some ways non-white descent, I'm also half white, and so kind of getting at what does that mean, right? I never learned Spanish, right? I was never taught Spanish, and so who really are my people, and how can I kind of dig that up, right? And so that's kind of what you're doing, the background of this paper. And so I'll go over the sort of the process that I want you to go through in writing it. But for now, that's just the context, right? So, what is my group? What are my cultures?